Hello, everybody. I am John Knopflinger. I am the Dean of the College of Business and Public Policy. Welcome to this webinar. As you likely know, last Friday marked the 1-year point since Russia invaded Ukraine. Recently, of course, President Biden had a surprise visit to Kiev, which is a reminder that this is still very much a central political issue with the United States. And of course, here in Alaska, we're not only right next door to Russia, but this prompted a worldwide energy crisis, which also impacts Alaska. We've even seen on the news, and you may have seen personally, some Ukrainian refugees. So what have we learned from these past 12 months? And what does the future look like for Eastern Europe? Today, we'll walk through the Russian invasion and what it means for Alaska and the US. We're pleased to welcome back Dr. Chad Briggs, who has worked in Ukraine for over 10 years, both with the US military and later cooperating with the Ukrainian defense sector. He remains a research professor here at the Institute, the ISER, Institute of Social and Economic Research. And to moderate this session, we have Dr. Diane Hirschberg, Director of ISER. So Chad is going to make some opening comments. And please enter your questions through the Q&A button, and so we can have a discussion afterwards. Take it away, Dr. Briggs.
All right, thank you so much, John, for the invitation. And even if I'm only virtually back in Alaska, I'm glad to be here and be able to talk to everyone. Just point out, I have worked in Ukraine for many years. I don't wish to say that I speak on behalf of all Ukrainians, or when I speak of the Russian Federation, that I can look into the mind of the Kremlin. But I've experience in these areas for decades, and I'm hoping just to give a little bit of an update. And I'll talk for a little while, and then I'll try to leave plenty of time for questions, because that's really, I think, what a lot of people have when we talk about Ukraine. I can't explain everything. So please do ask your questions, and then we'll get to those as best we can. So I'm going to share my screen, and we'll walk through a little bit about what's happened over this past year. And I'll start with a little bit of history. Of course, I could go on about this for an entire semester, but just to point out the context here, because sometimes there are questions about, well, who started the war? Was Ukraine a real country? Was this justified in any way? And to point out that Ukraine got its independence from the Soviet Union in 1992. This was following many years that were difficult for Ukraine. Ukrainians were often the victims of violence from Moscow, whether you're looking at the Holodomor famine in the 1930s, millions of people died, Chernobyl in 1986. And once it got its independence, very crucially, there was the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. Now, this meant that Russia and the United States and a few other signatories, they guaranteed Ukrainian sovereignty in exchange for Ukraine giving up all of the nuclear weapons that had been left on its territory when it got its independence. Now, that's still very important for Ukrainians, because they still think that this has been violated. And of course, legally it has been. But they're looking to the United States for help, not just in some sort of current event politics, but because this was fundamental to the establishment of the Ukrainian country. Now, you jump forward a couple of decades to 2014, and this was really what sparked off the war. So even though we talked about the 1-year anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine, really that started 9 years ago. Now, in 2014, really started 2013, you had increasing protests against the president at that time, Viktor Yanukovych. Now, this was for a number of reasons. One of the sparks was because he was withdrawing Ukraine from discussions with the European Union about free trade. But a lot of it had to do with corruption. It had to do with fears of increased control from Moscow. If Kiev had turned away from the EU and had gone just to Moscow and the Eurasian Union, that would have been just them controlling it. And even then, this was controversial politics within Ukraine. The country was largely split. But once Yanukovych was deposed, he immediately went to Moscow. And almost the day after that, starting the day after that, Russia started moving against Ukraine militarily, beginning with the occupation of the Crimean Peninsula. But then later that year, they also started what we call proxy war, meaning Russia didn't admit that it was directly involved, but really was supporting separatists in the eastern oblasts of Luhansk and Donetsk. And this became an escalation because increasingly Ukrainian forces and Russian or Russian-backed forces were firing at one another. There was open conflict for the past 9 years. And the European Union and the United States really didn't get directly involved until July of 2014, when Malaysian airliner Flight 17 was shot down by a Russian missile. Now, after that, there were increasing sanctions against Russia, but it really ended up as a stalemate for a number of years, and what we would call a hybrid war, meaning there was open warfare, but there was a lot else that was happening under the surface that sometimes we in the United States didn't see. When I was studying Russian in Kiev about 5 years ago, there were frequent assassinations. The Ukrainian military leaders had to be very careful, even when getting into their car, to avoid car bombs. And there were cyber attacks, not just upon Ukrainian energy infrastructure, but upon infrastructure, logistics, things that even spilled out as far as Alaska, and companies like FedEx and UPS were affected. But last year really did change everything. And this surprised many of us. I'll admit that I gave a briefing a week before February 24th last year, and we knew something was going to happen, but we didn't expect it to be at this scale. So this was an abandonment of the previous Maskirovka, where they sort of denied that they're really getting involved. And this was an all-out invasion. And the intention of this was to capture Kiev as quickly as possible. They were hoping that if they could capture Kiev, maybe within 72 hours, the war would be over. Russia would install a new leader, Ukraine would fall, but that didn't happen. There was intense resistance from the Ukrainians. Zelensky refused to leave the capital. And a lot of things fell apart for the Russian military. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that, and I won't go into detail here. I've written about it elsewhere with my Ukrainian colleagues, but essentially it can be summarized in terms of there was very poor organization. Most of the Russian military units were very, very severely under strength, and they simply didn't act in the way that was going to be coordinated enough to be able to really take and hold territory. So the Russians would advance, Ukrainian territorial troops would cut off the supply lines, and much of the initial axes of attack just sort of fell apart. Russia did take control of areas in the northeast and the north around Kharkiv. They moved in around areas that had already been separatist backed, Luhansk and Donetsk, and they moved up from the Crimean Peninsula towards Kherson and created what we call a land bridge here so that forces could meet up because there's no easy way to get from Crimea into Russia. Also, importantly, the Russians failed to take or seriously attack Odessa. That doesn't really come up very often, but we wargamed this in Kiev about 2017, a full-out invasion. And Odessa was really key. And for various reasons, including the intelligence of the Ukrainian forces, Odessa has largely been left intact. And that's been very, very important. So Russia sort of fell back on tactics that they've used in Syria, in Chechnya, which was attacking civilians, attacking civilian infrastructure. And then very specifically in October, starting with attacking energy infrastructure. And that's an important point that I'll get back to because it has a lot to do with what we see now in terms of global geopolitics. And this is where essentially we stand today. So Ukraine, starting last spring, have managed to recapture these territories around Kharkiv, around Kherson, and right now it's largely stalemated around cities like Bakhmut here in the center. This is partly because both sides have dwindling ammunition. They've lost an enormous number of troops, both sides, and this has to be emphasized. So keep in mind that when Russia invaded last year, they had approximately 200,000 troops that they used for the invasion. Now, they've since lost 3/4 of those troops. Now, they're widely varying estimates of what sort of damages that the Russians and Ukrainians have taken, but I'll take these to be about the best guesstimates that I've seen. So essentially, Russia has lost upwards of 150,000 troops, either killed or wounded. Now, they can replace those. They have been replacing those with mass mobilization, with pressing conscripts into service, using mercenaries, particularly the Wagner Group. And those are things that I can explain in more detail. Ukraine itself has probably lost about 100,000 in terms of military casualties, and somewhere in the order of 40,000 civilian casualties. Although, again, that's simply an estimate, and it could be higher. This has been extraordinarily damaging for both countries, but it's really shown the underwhelming performance of the Russian military. And the Russian military really had to work in terms of always trying to pretend that it was stronger than it was. And the joke now is that it's gone from the second most powerful army in the world to being beaten by the second largest country in Europe. And it's been, I think, humiliating for the Russian military, for Putin. And this might have helped to explain why Putin has been doubling down in terms of what he's been talking about in politics, saber-rattling, including with nuclear forces, which is not something that I'd like to completely discount, although we'd certainly hope that that's not going to go to that particular area. So I can start this, let's see if this video starts here. Now, I showed a video similar to this about a year ago when the Russians had invaded Mariupol. And this is really just to emphasize, this is showing Bakhmut, emphasize the damage that's occurred within the country. And it's been so extensive. Ukraine itself, area-wise, is approximately the size of Texas. Population-wise, it's larger than either California or Canada. It's an enormous country, and it has enormous wealth in terms of culture, in terms of history, in terms of science and whatnot. And so much of that has been destroyed. And so reconstruction is something that, even while the war goes on, is something that we still have to think about right now. And also because this plays into the larger geopolitics of what is the role of Europe, what is the role of the United States, and especially when we talk about energy politics. So the change in geopolitics is very important. And this is a slide that, again, I could probably spend hours talking about any one of these particular topics. But these things have really surprised us. So for someone like me who's lived in Europe and studied it for decades, I never, to the first point, would have imagined seeing Sweden and Finland applying for NATO membership. Now, for a long time, they've been friends with NATO, they've officially been partners, but to be an official member and to give away the neutrality that has been central to Finland's identity ever since the Second World War, and for Sweden for far longer, is really quite striking. And it really shows just how much countries within Europe see that the geopolitical balance has changed and how afraid they are, and justifiably so, about the Russian threat. That if they don't stand up to what's happening now, they could easily be next. Whether it's in the Baltics, whether it's in Finland, whether it's in Poland, whether it's in Moldova, these are countries that are really afraid of, what will happen if Ukraine fails? What will happen if it falls? Now, the application is going forward. I should point out that the Swedish application is being held up by Turkey. Otherwise, all the other NATO countries are full on board, and they would be able to be full NATO members quite quickly once they get past the political wrangling, because they've worked for so long and they'd be enormous assets to NATO. Now, one of the other changes has been the real change in internal resolve and sometimes dissent within Europe and within the European Union. So I mentioned Hungary here, and with Hungary, I should point out, I've spent years living in Hungary, both as a student and later as professor. Hungary is a bit of an enigma, but it really boils down to the politics of Viktor Orban. But Hungary is really the exception that proves the rule. That for many years, decades really, going back to the Soviet times, there's always been a divide and rule approach by Moscow towards energy relations with any European country. Is to say that Moscow never wanted Europe to have a coherent energy policy that was going to be controlled, whether it was from Brussels or whether from the energy community in Vienna. Rather, they wanted to play everyone off one another. They wanted to increase the dependence of those countries upon cheap gas and oil and coal from the Russian Federation. And what we see now is that there's been enormous unity within the European Union, within the larger European neighborhood. And that did surprise us. And by us, meaning, when I was at the State Department last year, it did come as a surprise, even though there was a lot of movement behind the scenes that people didn't see. But when Europeans showed up to meetings in Brussels, they were almost falling over themselves, country by country, saying, how can we react against this? How can we do something? How can we show some sort of unity? So there's been a series of very severe sanctions that's been placed upon Russia in terms of its energy sector, economic sector, financial sector. And this has been very important because for so many decades, Europe has been very dependent upon Russia, in particular, its oil and gas sector. And that's something I'm going to get back to in just a minute. So the global response as well has been generally fairly strong. Although I will point out that Moscow has been playing other partners and other countries, so that when you look at the UN map of what are the countries that voted on resolutions to basically condemn the Russian invasion, and you'll see a lot of abstentions. And the abstentions will come from large parts of Africa. Russian influence in Africa continues to be very strong and perhaps is increasing in importance because of this war. Seen it with India, we've seen it with China, and very recently China's rolled out what they call peace talks, and really many people, I think, in Ukraine would view this as simply being a Moscow-based approach. And again, I'll get back to the idea of peace talks in a little bit. Because this really has put a strain, all of the sanctions, not just from the US and its allies, but around the world, including very key sanctions on technology, for example. So for the US to be able to get Taiwan to agree to cut off semiconductor production and shipment to Russia, that really, really impacts the Russian military effort because Russia relies upon Western parts for any of its military. And it simply can't rebuild those without Western help. So the global response has been strong, but we don't know what that exactly means in terms of how long Russia is going to be able to hold out. So many people within Russia aren't even really aware that there's a full-blown war that's going on because the Russian government isn't telling them. They keep telling them that this is simply a special operation. They're trying to play down any sort of mobilization and conscription and draft of people. And especially in the rural areas, now that Russia has largely been cut off from the rest of the world's internet and social media, means that those areas are really reliant upon Russian media, and support for Putin is still, if you'll believe the public opinion polls from those areas, is still relatively high. So even though they may be feeling the economic pinch, that's going to be felt more in the cities. It's going to be felt more by people who may have already left Russia. In fact, there were hundreds of thousands of men who fled Russia once conscription started going into effect. And Russia can really withstand quite a bit. So even with all of the damage that's been inflicted on the Russian military, what we see in areas around Bakhmut, for example, is that they'll take the conscripts, they'll take very poorly trained new draftees, and they will throw them at the Ukrainian lines, literally as cannon fodder, meaning that they're trying to just draw down Ukrainian ammunition reserves by sacrificing as many Russian troops as they can. And then if any territory is held, then the more seasoned troops and the Wagner mercenaries will move in and take any of that territory. So if it's that sort of war of attrition, Russia has the advantage. And that's an important geopolitical point that if people are asking, well, why is it important for the United States and for Europe to support Ukraine? Because Ukraine really can't do this on its own. Ukraine may be a large country in European terms, but it is nowhere near as large as Russia. It just simply doesn't have the resources. And inasmuch as there are technology transfers that are going and weapons that are being promised to Ukraine, those Western weapons take a while to be trained. There's increasing training of Ukrainian troops by particularly Poland, Great Britain. But again, that takes time and they can only do so many troops at a time. So it really is, if there's a stalemate, if there's a war of attrition, that plays to Russia's advantage. And so therefore the Kremlin will try to drag out the conflict as long as possible, hoping that everyone else will simply grow tired of it and stop their support for Ukraine. And I'll also mention global food prices. This is something that we were really worried about last year. Ukraine is a major agricultural country. And even if you look at the flag of Ukraine with the sort of yellow underneath and blue above, this is meant to be a metaphor for fields of wheat and then the sky above. Agriculture, of course, has taken a huge hit because of the war. And especially in the East, it's unlikely that it's going to be restarted anytime soon, not only from the areas that are occupied, but even from the areas that conflict had occurred. Retreating Russian forces would often put unexploded ordnance, booby traps, landmines in agricultural lands. And this is something that we saw decades ago in the Balkans as a way of especially preventing any sort of agricultural production in the future. Now, this really hit North African and Middle East countries last summer because they were reliant upon these sorts of exports, and also Russian exports, which were increasingly coming under sanctions. They did finally come to an agreement to allow a certain amount of grain exports from Ukraine, but this is, I think, increasingly going to be an issue. All of us have seen inflation in food prices. This isn't just because of Ukraine, but it is a factor, especially for some of the Europeans, and especially when we talk about energy prices. And finally, I can mention Arctic governance, although we have Dr. Hirschberg here, and she can talk about this as well. It's very striking because the Arctic Council was being chaired by Russia at the time of the invasion, and essentially everyone else packed up and went home. So Russia, of course, is the largest Arctic country. And if no one else is willing to work with Russia, and there's no reason why we can trust Russia to work with them right now, at least in my view, then that does leave very significant holes in a lot of other projects, whether they're environmental, educational, any sort of monitoring. I've been asked all sorts of questions about what does this even do for science in the high north? You know, we have to know about climate science. It essentially means that there's a whole lot of the Arctic we don't know anything about right now, because we simply can't cooperate with Russian scientists the way that we have been past. So these things are really important. And I think especially for Alaska, that sort of withdrawal of Russia from the world stage is really important because it means that Arctic governance is going to be that much more difficult and that much trickier. Also means that the folks at JBER and Eielson Air Force Base are probably busier than usual. But let me go back a little bit and talk about energy, because again, this is something that I think Alaskans understand. As I said, probably about half of European energy imports, and of course, Europe has to import a lot of its energy, came from outside areas, and half of it came from Russia itself. There was a bit of a difference, of course, whether you're talking about oil, gas, or coal, but there was a huge dependence that these countries had upon the Russian Federation. And that meant then that as soon as the Russian invasion started, you had a huge price spike, flattened out a little bit over the summer, but then Russia was really restricting a lot of its gas supplies to countries like Germany. Supplies were really running short, and it was very, very difficult for other countries to fill in. Now, especially for things like gas. Oil is a little bit easier to ship. Coal, you can make substitutions as well. But gas is very, as many of you know, it's very difficult to ship. Either has to come in a pipeline or in an LNG facility. And you simply can't bottle it up and ship it any other way. Pipelines take a very long time to build. LNG facilities, even though Germany very quickly built and started one this past year, they're very expensive. They're also very difficult to build and get into operation. And even then, they only provide marginal gains. So even though Norway was increasing its production and its supplies to Europe, that didn't mean that it really filled in the gaps. Norway was only able to increase, I think, about 10 or 15% because many of the pipelines were already near capacity. For other countries, the US increased its LNG facility potential and shipments to countries like Portugal and to countries like Germany. But again, that was relatively small percentages in terms of the total energy budget for the countries. Now, one thing that was a little bit ironic from a climate standpoint was that Europe had a very, very warm winter, which meant that it didn't have to rely upon gas supplies quite as much as it had to. And it's literally speaking weathered that winter. And so prices have gone back down. But even though they've gone back down, they're still above a lot of the averages, and they're still quite volatile. But the Europeans have really trying to come to grips with this, and they're decreasing their reliance upon gas as much as they can. Now, this is partly from alternative supplies, US, Norway, areas in the Middle East or North Africa, but they're also moving as much as they can to renewable energy. That's really important because this was politically important for Europe for many years, but countries really couldn't get on board in a sort of coordinated fashion. There were always discussions in Vienna and in Brussels about, well, okay, we'll do energy transition, we'll move away from fossil fuels, but there wasn't really a coherent strategy exactly for how to do that. There were simply country by country commitments, and then they would have to overcome bilateral agreements or worries about networking issues of electricity. But this has really created a lot of resolve, where a lot of countries have simply said, that's it. We're really suffering. We can't rely upon Russia, and we can't amp up supplies from other countries quickly enough. So renewables are really where we have to go. And then also keep in mind that there have been some shocks this past year in the energy sector. And this has surprised us. I was teaching energy and environmental security at Johns Hopkins in the fall. And when the explosions took place on the Nord Stream pipelines, there were a lot of discussions about who did it. A lot of the countries were saying, well, Ukraine must have done it. And then my students who were military officers would have to patiently explain that, well, Ukraine doesn't have submarines. They can't really do this sort of thing, and they're occupied elsewhere. And no one really knew who else would do it. There aren't that many countries that had the capacity. We weren't really sure what the motivation would have been for Russia to destroy its own pipeline. But I would caution everyone, there's been a lot of discussion recently about how there's new evidence, and I say evidence very loosely because I think this is being pushed by the Kremlin, that the US did it, that the US was behind this. Take everything with a grain of salt, please, because honestly, we don't know who did it. But this was a geopolitical shock in many ways. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which had recently been completed, had been a bone of contention between the US and Germany for years. Germany wanted it. US warned against it. They said, this is too much reliance upon Russia. You're simply bypassing existing pipelines in Ukraine. Don't do this. Don't build it. And we're trying to block it. But after the Russian invasion last year, the company essentially went bankrupt. And then it's been blown to bits. I point this out just because it's one of those incidents that has gone far beyond Ukrainian borders. This happened right on the border with Sweden, right near one of the Swedish islands, and also near Danish territory. So it was something that has really worried those countries, and also kind of shakes up a lot of the calculus about where oil and gas are going to come from in the future. But also keep in mind that last summer was brutally difficult for Europe. So July of last year, although really for the entire summer, Europe experienced just record high temperatures. And this was important not only from the point of view of public health. Estimates are that approximately 30,000 people in Europe died last year as a result of these heat waves. But you had entire rivers drying up in Western France. You had temperatures you'd simply never seen in Great Britain before. And also from an energy standpoint, remember what it was like in Anchorage in the summer of 2019, when suddenly it got up into the 90s. Nothing is designed for those sorts of temperatures. And so if you're worried about your energy security, high temperatures and climate issues is also a really important factor. It's not just that you want to be good to the climate, you want to be a good climate citizen, reduce greenhouse gases. It also means that you've designed these thermal power plants with the idea in mind that they will never exceed certain tolerances in terms of temperature of either the air or the coolant water. And we're going way beyond those tolerances right now. So at a time when, and increasingly Europeans are using more and more air conditioning, you have energy spikes in terms of demand, and you simply can't provide that sort of energy. And energy is extraordinarily expensive at the same time. So this also comes into any of the calculations the Europeans have about, well, what does this mean for them? And what it means is essentially they're going to look more for renewable energies, partly because they're better able to withstand temperature variances. They're decentralized, and of course, solar panels don't really care how hot it is out. And it's difficult to really put this into words because I was in Europe in 2003 when they had one of their heat waves. I cannot imagine a temperature of 90 degrees plus in London. It's simply so miserable because nothing is built for those sorts of temperature extremes. So let me get to the idea of what comes next, and then I'll turn it over to Q&A because I'm sure people do have some questions about what's happened or what's going to happen in the future. So as I said, we have a current stalemate around the city of Bakhmut in central eastern Ukraine. No one really knows what's going to happen next in terms of military balance. Ukrainians have surprised us before. The spring offensive of last year was very well coordinated. It was very well carried out, certainly surprised the Russian forces. But there could be a spring counteroffensive from the Russians. There's been some talk of that. Certainly the Russian mobilization means that they're going to have many more troops available than the Ukrainians are. Ukraine, even as many pieces of equipment as they can get from the West, if you don't have men and women on the front line, you simply can't hold the lines then. And we simply have to sort of wait and see what happens in that sense. Both sides are low on supplies, on ammunition. There are some worries that Russia is going to get some of its military supplies from China. I think North Korea already offered artillery shells. But a lot of other supplies are also going to be missing. The standoff weapons that Russia has used, meaning its cruise missiles, those have more or less been depleted. And like I said, because of sanctions, Russia's not able to build any of the new ones. They have increasingly used drone strikes and kamikaze drone strikes. This is a sort of new method of warfare that we really haven't seen before. And I think it's going to be a new page in warfare of remote operation of unmanned aerial vehicles. We've seen it to a limited extent even in Saudi Arabia and Yemen, but this is sort of full blown. And this does bring into play then other countries like Iran, like Turkey, countries that are producing a lot of these cheaper drones. So as I said before, a long attrition war does favor Russia. The immense size of the Russian population means that if they're willing, and there's a long history of this going back to Tsarist and Soviet times, simply throwing bodies at your enemy, again, that's going to favor Russia in the long term. So a war of attrition, as resilient as the Ukrainians are, and I give them full credit for how resilient they've been, for the leadership that Zelensky's shown, but countries don't have unlimited amounts of resilience and the ability to withstand attack after attack and year after year of this. And we're not sure what role China is going to play. There has been, from the very beginning, a discussion that there's this sort of so-called unlimited friendship between Moscow and Beijing, but we don't really know what that means. Personally, I think that Beijing was a little surprised at what happened last time, and the fact that it happened during the Beijing Olympics probably didn't make them very happy either. But the extent to which China helps is going to be an outstanding question that we have to look in the future, and other countries as well. I mean, if Delhi gets involved, that really could also be one of the game changers. So there have been calls for peace talks, and let me give a little bit of background here. There have been peace talks all along. So ever since 2014, there's been something called the Normandy process, which then resulted in what many people might remember as the Minsk agreements. Now, these were largely being led by France, Britain, some of the Benelux countries. The US decided to let the Europeans try to take the leadership on this for various political reasons. But that's been, it's been ongoing, right? And the one thing that Ukraine, regardless of who was president at the time, regardless of other sorts of political pressures that Ukraine was receiving from the Europeans or from the Americans, Ukraine has never agreed to consider giving up territory. Crimea to them is still Ukraine, and they are not going to give it up. And one could possibly understand this, right? I mean, even though someone makes the argument that, well, Crimea used to belong to Russia, someone could say that about Alaska too. And of course, if Russian troops move into Alaska and the rest of the US said, oh yeah, it used to be Russia, just sort of hand it over. I mean, it's important for Ukrainians. So they're not going to engage in any sort of peace talks that mean that they have to give up territory, and then that legitimizes Russian actions. So as much as people talk about peace talks, keep in mind that if part of the calculus of the peace talk means that Ukraine agrees to give up large pieces of territory, it's simply never going to fly. No one in Kiev is ever going to agree to that. And like I said, one of the outstanding questions, and this is because this is an area that I've worked in for many years, starting the Balkans, is the question of reconstruction. So recently, the Ukrainian energy minister had pointed out that approximately half of all energy infrastructure in Ukraine is now damaged or destroyed. For a country as large as that is, that's really staggering. And it does come as the result of, as I said, starting in October, deliberate and targeted strikes by Russian forces against Ukrainian energy infrastructure across the entire country, not simply in the east. Now, what reconstruction means, of course, is that we have to think carefully about, well, what would Ukraine look like once we reconstruct it? Who's in control? Politically, that's a decision for Ukrainians, but if you're asking about the energy mix, right? And as Alaskans, we think about this in terms of, well, yeah, I mean, wouldn't they just want to, restart what they've already had? A lot of electricity in Ukraine comes from nuclear power plants. As you all know, and if you haven't seen Chernobyl on HBO, it's very well done. Ukraine has a very, very bad history with nuclear power plants. And it's something that worries them now. And it's something that is getting played upon by Russian forces. So one of the areas that's still occupied by Russian forces is Zaporizhia. And that's the site of the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. It's been damaged. Some people say damaged quite severely, or at least alarmingly, by Russian forces. And the International Energy Association has been able to get in there. But it's worrying, right? I mean, these are things that if in the future, the Ukrainians are going to be asked, well, why don't you just restart your nuclear power plants? A lot of Ukrainians are just going to shake their heads and say, oh, no, sorry, we tried that before. And it's kind of dangerous. And there's a lot of wind and solar potential in that country. So I'm not simply pushing this as a political point of my own, but knowing Ukraine and knowing what it takes to reconstruct a country, once you reconstruct energy infrastructure, it makes sense to decentralize it. Centralize large power plants and then the sort of hub and spoke, that's, by many people's estimates, kind of early 20th century technology. And it doesn't really fit. And also because those power plants and those sorts of distributed infrastructures are also more resilient against cyber attacks, which is something that Ukraine has suffered very, very severely, really before 2014, but certainly after 2014, and something that they're going to really keep into account once they start rebuilding. But they're also going to need money to do this. Now, I've seen some sort of estimates of what it's going to cost to reconstruct Ukraine. Of course, that's wildly estimated, but we're looking at upwards of several $1 trillion potentially. Certainly $500 billion to get just the basic infrastructure going, to get people moved back. There are currently about 8 million Ukrainians that are displaced, either within Ukraine or to other parts of Europe. And I will give credit to the Europeans. Their reaction to all the migrants that were moving into other parts of the EU, particularly Poland, has been exemplary. Now, of course, one could criticize them for past actions, and I have, but they did exceptionally well for this. They simply said that any Ukrainian who is on EU territory is not going to have to apply for asylum. They will immediately be given benefits of living in the countries in terms of children's education, in terms of work opportunities, in terms of medical care. And that came out very swiftly. And again, that was a big surprise for all of us. And if we can see that sort of unity come out in the future, then the future may be bright, but it's still going to be very dark times, I think, for Eastern Europe for the near future. I do want to stop it there and give time for questions, because I know that Dr. Hirschberg has to leave at the top of the hour. But Diane, if you want to step in and I'll take a look at the Q&A too here.
Great. Yes, there are some really good questions, and of course the comments. Spasiba za vashu robotu from Patrick Pragman, who also goes on to ask, isn't the Russian stance on climate change basically we're for it because of opening up ports, arable lands, and so forth?
Yeah, I can start with that. I'm actually writing an article about that at the moment. Russia is all for climate change, but not for the reasons that sometimes we think. Because actually, the warmer that Russia gets, the harder it is for them to work with their energy infrastructure. So many of their pipelines are built on permafrost. And as everyone knows in Alaska, once permafrost starts melting, it's really hard to build anything on it because it essentially turns to marshland. But the Russian motivation is essentially that it's changed a little bit, but up to about a few years ago, 40% of all Russian government revenues came from the sale of oil and gas abroad. So anything that Moscow could do to keep other countries from adapting to renewables helped the Russian government. And from their interpretation then, anyone who was going to these UNFCCC meetings and talking about climate change and sustainability, that was attacking Russia. That directly harmed Russia's national security. So that was the big motivation. I don't think that, because I've worked on the port issues in Russia, and you can look at areas like Teraberka in the north, where they had this idea that they were going to mine some of the natural gas and put it in a pipeline and send it south and then to Europe. And I remember that we filed a report. This was all unclassified, so I can talk about it. There was a report with the Air Force where we said, no, that's not going to happen. And the reason is because the proposed pipeline went along permafrost areas, and that was starting to melt, and they simply couldn't build the pipeline anymore. Also, once the sanctions started hitting in 2014, they've lost a lot of the technology they needed to do things like offshore drilling, because the companies they were relying on for that, ExxonMobil, Statoil, all those countries are now essentially barred from working with Russia, and Russia doesn't have the technology for that. So, yeah, Russia's climate policies are not positive, I would say, but it's not because they think that everything's going to be really peachy and they're going to have more agriculture. What we've seen is that when heat waves hit Russia, things start to tend to catch on fire. Not too different from Alaska, really.
Great. So there's two questions that I think are half of a whole story with U.S. and Russia relations. So I'm going to ask both of them together.
Okay.
The first is from John Nossinger. If Russia wins this war, will we enter a new and expensive Cold War? And then Greg Protassel asked, do you see the decline in U.S., or do you see there being a decline in U.S. support for Ukraine now that the Republicans control the U.S. House? So I think this is, what direction are we headed in U.S. policy generally?
Okay. Hi, Greg. Thanks for that. I don't like to think about what happens if Russia wins. It's definitely gonna hurt European politics, and the Eastern Europe is really, aside from certain people like Viktor Orban, who's hoping he could just be friendly to Russia, people in Eastern Europe are really afraid of what's going on. And I lived for 4 years in Kosovo before Alaska, and Russian politics just it played so large there in terms of dependence on energy supplies, even if it's just secondary or tertiary. So prices go up elsewhere, and they're going to go up in the neighboring community. But politically, it would be so damaging, both for U.S. standing and I think for Western standing. Because what we saw last week when Putin and Biden gave speeches pretty much on the same day, and they were so diametrically different in terms of the vision that they were giving for the world, and we don't want to go to Putin's world. And I say this as I personally, Russia's a great country. It's just that it has bad management, and we don't want to be there. But to get to Greg's question, that's really, it's difficult. I'm right across the river from DC. And yeah, there is increasingly concern over, what's going to happen in Congress in terms of funding, in terms of support for the war. We see on media, the Republicans seem to be a bit split. It's not unified. And there isn't just like one view of things. I would be really surprised if, and this is actually a cynical view I'm taking, I'd be very surprised if military support for Ukraine were cut. Partly because it's not just up to the political leaders, but also you have really big companies like Boeing and Lockheed Martin who are, this is good for business for them. Their influence is gonna play large. But I would say that watch out for humanitarian, and that includes energy support and assistance, because I think there'll be kind of a sleight of hand, and people will say, yes, we support Ukraine, we're going to give them funding, but when that's going to be military funding, and when people aren't watching, they're going to cut the humanitarian assistance and reconstruction funds. That's what I would worry about the most. But once we get into the election season next year, oh God, is it next year already? Ukraine's going to be a big factor. And that really depends on who the players are. I will say that a certain previous administration was not really friendly with Ukraine. I mean, there was a whole impeachment, hearing and vote done just because of someone trying to coerce Ukraine. And one of the reasons why the 2017 war game that we did turned out so badly was because Ukraine and the Europeans couldn't rely on Washington's support. And the Europeans will admit this now. They say they can't do this without the US. As unified as people are in Europe, they still need the US behind them in terms of support and pushing them and saying that, look, the White House, Congress, we're all behind this. So hopefully that answers the question by not answering it in some ways. But but like I said, I would say keep an eye out for humanitarian assistance, because I don't think that gets enough eyes, and especially if it goes through the UN, that's going to get hit hard in Congress.
Wow. So you alluded to this when you were talking, but maybe you want to dig in a little bit more deeply. A couple people have asked, what is the how real is the risk with nuclear escalation or the possibility of a strike?
Oh, that's from Joey.
Oh, actually, there's Christopher Hellman and Stan Moiseev have also asked that.
Oh, okay. I know that there are plans in place by the Russian military to use tactical nuclear weapons or chemical or biological weapons. Whether, of course, we can always have plans and then we decide not to use them, and that's always the hope. The question, of course, is up to Putin, right? And there could be subsidiary questions about, is command and control, hard enough that if it gets to a lower level commander, can they just say, no, we're not going to do this? But the problem with the Kremlin politics is that anyone who's in charge in the Kremlin knows that he's probably not going to leave office, on his own power. Gorbachev and Yeltsin were like the two exceptions to that, but Putin's certainly not going to just walk away and live in a resort someplace in Sochi. So if he feels that his political support is dwindling, if he feels that he's losing the war, he may feel that he doesn't have anything left to lose. And I'll say I'm less worried about this now than I was 12 months ago, but that doesn't mean that it's disappeared. And certainly if you look at, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists always has their countdown clock, how close are we to midnight? And right now it's at 90 seconds, which is as close as it's ever been, which means that it is real. It is real. And all it would take is maybe an incident, one of the nuclear reactors, which is then misinterpreted as a dirty bomb. And then Russia decides to retaliate by using tactical nuclear weapons. Now, again, there wouldn't be any military use for nuclear weapons. There's nothing that can be gained militarily from using them. But so many of the Russian tactics this past year have just been directed against civilians. So if they lob one against Kiev or Odessa, it could happen. And NATO's just had to be very resolute in saying that we will not tolerate that. But maybe Moscow is just hoping that as long as it doesn't affect NATO territory, that they might be able to get away with it. So I can't really give you a definitive answer because no one knows. All I'm saying is that there is a real risk of it, and it shouldn't be discounted. It's just saying, oh no, that would be too crazy, and no one would ever do that sort of thing. Because I was wrong last year about the invasion in general.
Patrick Bregman and I have actually related questions, so I'm going to ask both of ours together. You had mentioned that polls show support for Putin, but I'm wondering how much we can trust those when I think there are many people who feel that they can't speak. They can't necessarily be forthcoming with their actual views because of feeling that they are not secure. And I'm wondering if these polls might be as manipulated as some of the other media there. And Patrick's asking, which I think is a related question, is can you comment on internal resistance in Russia and Belarus? He said there are some different groups that are organizing active and sometimes violent resistance to Putin's regime. And how does that play into these the current disputes?
Well, certainly there's been a crackdown on a lot of the internal resistance. I mean, this has been going on for years, but certainly with Navalny in jail and with a lot of other key leaders and journalists being killed, we don't know exactly what's happening. And one lesson from Eastern Europe to keep in mind is that these systems are always really brittle. So I'm reminded of a story from one of my first political science professors, Sven Steinmo. In all his modesty, was saying that a student once asked him, "Professor, when will the Berlin Wall come down?" And he stood in the head of the class and very proudly proclaimed, "Not in my lifetime." Yeah, and that was the beginning of the semester in 1989. And 2 months later, the wall came down. So we don't know. I wouldn't really trust a lot of the opinion polls, except that it sort of makes sense. And this is what we're also hearing informally on the ground, that rural areas will still support Putin because they don't get information from anywhere else. And there's no obvious alternative to Putin. Of course, he's wanted it that way. But if Putin were to die overnight or be deposed, we don't know who would take over. Medvedev has tried to put himself in that place, but he's fallen out of favor before. It could be a technocrat. But all I would say is that there is internal resistance, but a lot of the people who would have been key to that, I think, fled the country once the draft went into effect. So you have a lot of Russians who are now living in Armenia and in Turkey, Georgia, and they're not. I don't see a lot of organized resistance from them on the outside trying to foment stuff inside Russia. Maybe it exists, but I don't see it. And certainly with the loss of social media, American-based social media inside Russia, that sort of communication has become more and more difficult.
So Bogdan Wanka has a really interesting question. China and India are getting oil at a 40% discount thanks to the sanctions from the West. He asked, what incentive will they have to support a peace process as opposed to an incentive to keep the conflict going?
It's a good question. Of course, everyone keep in mind that the reason why there was a price cap on oil was because with energy prices going up, you could sell the same amount or even less amount and then still make a huge profit. It is true that a lot of the oil sales could go to India or China, but the problem is how to get them there. There's only one small pipeline between China and Russia right now, and because there's very little infrastructure in the Russian Far East, and for all sorts of reasons, demographic, climatological, what have you, it's very difficult to set that up. And Russia and China have historically never really gotten on very well, when it comes to that, because China sees Siberia as its territory in some ways historically. So if Russia can figure out how to ship the oil to China and India, then maybe those countries, get a good deal. But increasingly, there's also been talk about, all it takes is underwriters for the oil tankers, say Lloyd's of London, to simply say, no, anything coming from Russia, we're just not going to insure it anymore. And they've already started that to a certain point where you start seeing black market or sort of pirate oil tankers around the world, who claim, oh no, we didn't come from Russia, we came from this other port. But I think the broader question of support from Beijing and Delhi, that is a big question. It is important for the US to be able to engage, not just in terms of our bilateral relationships with India and China, but also understanding that Moscow is pushing them very hard. And whether it's with Modi or with Xi, they tend to be fairly friendly to the Kremlin these days. And they'll have all sorts of incentives, including, promises of, hey, sell us weapons, which used to be the other way around. But now if India and China can sell weapons to the Russians, then, that would be a great deal from Moscow's point of view.
So Mariah asked, what is stopping Russia from taking over Moldova as part of the conflict?
So Moldova was something that I worried about, and some of my colleagues worried about the most last year, because there are already Russian troops in the territory of Transnistria in Moldova. And if any conflict broke out there, like if the Russians had managed an amphibious landing in Odessa and hooked up in Transnistria, that might have brought in Romania, which is a NATO country, into the conflict. I think NATO's been very, very strong in communicating to the Kremlin that Moldova, look, you're already in Moldova, but no further, right? I mean, this really risks bringing NATO into the fight if you escalate things in Moldova. And the troops in Moldova, the Russian troops in Moldova, are largely cut off. They don't have, there isn't like a major air base. They don't have port access. So, I had assumed at one point that, yeah, they could simply hook up and these troops would move in. They're there, but they're not really all that useful. So I would say that it's still a flashpoint, but it's one of the things that NATO very early on identified as a flashpoint, and something that they had through back channels to communicate to the Kremlin. Look, you can't go there. You simply cannot go there because, we will respond if Romania gets drawn into this conflict. But it's a good question because, a lot of people, certainly Americans, haven't heard of Moldova, but it is very important to this question.
Another good question from Todd Shipley is, as the Russian military weakens with the war in Ukraine, what is the possibility of other areas breaking away, or at least trying to break away from Russia?
That's possible. It may be areas that aren't directly under Russian control first, right? So you may see countries that have Russian troops or border guards, like Armenia, sort of move farther and farther away from Moscow's orbit. And this does affect the war in Armenia and Azerbaijan, which has been sort of an on again, off again thing. Internally into Russia, that would be more difficult, certainly. And maybe in areas like around Grozny or these sort of Muslim areas, but I don't want to make a prediction there, just because again, that goes into the brittleness of Russian and Kremlin politics. If it happens, I probably won't be surprised. I may be shocked, but not surprised.
And I'm going to put two questions together for a very quick little bit of advice from you, which is, one is, where do you recommend that we go to continue to get good information on what's happening with the war? And if people on this call want to support Ukraine, are there organizations that you would suggest sending money to? I always know the Red Cross and the Red Crescent is one, but I don't know if there's any other specific humanitarian organizations that you think are particularly effective there.
That's a good question. I don't know if I could just in 30 seconds off the top of my head say I'd be happy to come up with a list of both organizations and maybe some of the best media sites, because some media sites aren't the traditional ones, but you can find them on Twitter or Mastodon, and a lot of them are people who are just reporting from the front lines and from inside Ukraine and from Europe. And there are a number of them that I do trust more than others. So I'll be happy to come up with a list if we're, if there's a way that if we can post that on the college, yeah, or that could be emailed to everyone afterwards as well.
Well, I want to thank you, Chad, very much for this really interesting and enlightening webinar. Thank you, Diane, for handling the Q&A. I want to thank all the people here in the college behind the scenes that make these webinars happen. And while you have put on a fabulous discussion here, Chad, I really don't want to invite you back for 2 years later. Okay, so hopefully we won't have to do that. We'll invite you back for a different topic is what I hope to do sometime. And so if you could come up with a couple of lists like that, yeah, we can email that. People register for this with their email, so we can send that list via that way to the people. So I just want to thank everyone for coming and asking great questions and being informed. So everybody have a great afternoon.